This story is one of the worst I have ever heard. It is very cruel and scary. He was just 10 years old. His teachers tried to help. His neighbors called for help. But the system failed him. This is the heartbreaking story of Takoda Collins, the little boy who never had a chance to escape. So get ready, because this one is really bad. Takoda Collins was a bright and innocent 10-year-old boy who had dreams just like every other child. But behind closed doors, his world was filled with unimaginable pain. His father, Almutahan McLean, was supposed to protect him. Instead, he became his worst nightmare. Despite multiple cries for help, Takoda's suffering continued until it was too late. Today, we tell his story not just to remember him, but to make sure this never happens to another child again. On December 13th, 2019, at around 5 p.m., a 911 dispatcher in Dayton, Ohio, received a call from a father claiming his son was unresponsive. The caller, Almutahan McLean, spoke in a way that felt more frustrated than panicked. Instead of pleading for help or sounding desperate, he complained. He said his son had been acting out all day and wouldn't listen. The dispatcher instructed him to begin CPR, but as McLean attempted it, he gagged. He pulled away and muttered, "It smells real rotten inside his stomach." The dispatcher urged him to keep going, but McLean continued to focus on himself. He rambled about how difficult it was to be a parent and how Takoda was disobedient. Minutes later, paramedics and police officers arrived at the Kensington Drive residence. McLean was waiting at the door, showing no sign of distress. When they rushed inside, they found 10-year-old Takoda Collins lying lifeless on the living room floor. His body was covered in bruises and scars, his face swollen, and his limbs covered in wounds old and new. The paramedics tried to revive him, but the extent of his injuries was overwhelming. It was clear that Takoda had suffered repeated abuse. One paramedic whispered to another, "This isn't just an accident. This child has been beaten, over and over." While they worked, Officer Joshua Evans took McLean outside to talk. As Takoda lay inside fighting for life, his father continued ranting about his son's behavior. He showed no fear, no sadness, just irritation. Then the moment came. A paramedic stepped outside and delivered the news. Takoda was gone. And McLean's response was chilling. "All right, I tried to get you guys here as fast as I could." There were no tears, no disbelief, just those words. Something was very wrong in this house. And it was clear that Takoda had been suffering long before that 911 call. At the hospital, Dr. Richard Leichter, an expert in pediatrics, was one of the first to examine Takoda's body. What he found was horrifying. There were hundreds of injuries. Lacerations, bruises, and scars covered his body from his scalp, face and neck to his arms, legs, and back. Many of these wounds were in defensive areas, meaning Takoda had tried to protect himself from whoever was hurting him. As the autopsy began, Dr. Brian Casto, the deputy coroner, made even more shocking discoveries. Beneath Takoda's hair, deep bruising covered his entire scalp. His chest, abdomen, and back had internal bleeding. His lungs were filled with fluid, showing signs of drowning. Then, there was something even more disturbing. Takoda's stomach contained a tan, yellow puree, a substance that appeared identical to human waste. The doctors knew what this meant. Takoda had been forced to eat his own feces. The internal injuries were severe. His backside was bruised to the bone. There were half-inch lacerations in his private areas, and internal bleeding confirmed they were deep wounds. His ribs had been broken, but no record showed any treatment for them. The most significant injury was found at the back of his neck. The deep bruising extended through all layers of muscle, a type of trauma typically seen in high-impact car accidents. This suggested he had been brutally crushed, strangled, or thrown with extreme force. Dr. Casto concluded that Takoda had died from blunt force trauma, compressive asphyxia, and drowning. The manner of death was homicide. Even in a profession where they saw tragedies every day, the medical examiners were shaken. Takoda had endured relentless, unimaginable abuse. The question was, how had this been allowed to happen? As Takoda's body was examined at the hospital, detectives searched the house where he had lived and suffered. At first glance, the Kensington Drive home seemed ordinary. There was a living room, a furnished bedroom for McLean and his girlfriend, Amanda Haynes, and another room set up for Hines' sister, Jennifer Ebert. There was even a room filled with toys for a 3-year-old child. But something was missing. There was no sign of Takoda. No bedroom, no bed, no clothes, no school books. Then, officers noticed a door leading to the attic. When they opened it, a foul, suffocating smell hit them. The attic was dark and empty, except for a broken chair, filthy bedding, and human waste on the floor. This was where Takoda had been kept. There was no light, no heat, no comfort, just filth and suffering. As detectives searched, they found a dismantled security camera. McLean had been watching Takoda from the living room below. Hines later admitted that McLean disconnected the camera right before calling 911, knowing Takoda wouldn't survive. At that moment, it became clear that Takoda wasn't just neglected, he had been tortured. Takoda had not always lived this way. When he was born in 2009, his mother, Robin Collins, had custody. But in 2013, when Takoda was 4, she was sent to jail for harming him. McLean was granted full custody. For years, teachers at Horace Mann Elementary School tried to help. They noticed Takoda smelled of human waste, came to school in dirty clothes, and had odd, painful-looking haircuts that made him a target for bullying. The school called Child Protective Services, the Crown Prosecution Service, multiple times, but nothing changed. McLean hated that the school kept interfering. In May 2018, he withdrew Takoda from school, claiming he would homeschool him instead. But there was no homeschooling. Takoda never stepped into a classroom again. Without school, without friends, without teachers looking out for him, Takoda was now completely alone with his abusers. No one checked on him, no one saved him. For the next year and a half, Takoda lived in darkness, locked in an attic, beaten daily, forced to stand for hours, denied food and warmth. He had nowhere to turn. The last hours of Takoda Collins' life were filled with unimaginable suffering. On December 12, 2019, his father, Al-Matan and Glean, had been out drinking. When he returned home, he was already in a rage, and as he had done so many times before, he took it out on Takoda. McLean's punishments were brutal and unrelenting. That night, he punched Takoda in the stomach with full force, causing deep internal bruising. The boy was already weak from years of malnourishment, abuse, and neglect, but there was no mercy. Witnesses later confirmed that McLean struck him repeatedly, ignoring Takoda's cries for help. The next morning, Takoda struggled to stand. His body was failing him. His legs trembled, and he held onto the walls for support. Instead of helping, McLean shoved him hard, knocking him to the ground. When Takoda didn't get up quickly enough, McLean forced him into another painful punishment. For hours, Takoda was made to stand bent over, touching the floor, completely naked in the cold attic. If he moved, he was beaten. If he showed signs of pain, he was beaten harder. There was no escape. At one point, McLean left the attic and returned with a bottle of hot sauce. He poured it over Takoda's open wounds in private areas, something he had done before as a disciplinary tool. Takoda writhed in pain, but McLean only laughed at his suffering. Still not satisfied, McLean took a chair leg and shoved it inside the helpless child, inflicting wounds so severe that they would later be confirmed in the autopsy. Witnesses in the home later said that McLean had used this same chair leg on Takoda before, but this time, the boy's body couldn't take it anymore. Shortly after Takoda collapsed, he stopped moving, he stopped fighting, he stopped breathing. Even then, McLean didn't call 911 right away. Instead, he disconnected the security camera that had been monitoring Takoda's suffering and waited. It was only after several hours that he finally dialed 911, pretending to be a concerned father. When paramedics arrived, they could see the truth immediately. Takoda's body was covered in bruises, scars, and fresh wounds. He had been living in unimaginable conditions, locked away, starved, and beaten daily. By the time he was taken to the hospital, it was too late. His body had already shut down. Takoda Collins, just 10 years old, was gone. McLean showed no emotion when he was told that his son was dead. His only response was, "All right, I tried to get you guys here as fast as I could." But the truth was, he hadn't tried at all. Takoda's suffering had lasted years, and no one had been able to save him. Now, detectives had a new mission to make sure McLean, and those who had stood by and let this happen, would never walk free again. After Takoda Collins was pronounced dead, law enforcement officers immediately launched an investigation into what had happened inside the Kensington Drive home. From the moment they arrived, the evidence of abuse and neglect was overwhelming. Detectives remained at the scene, questioning Al-Mutahan McLean, as well as his live-in girlfriend, Amanda Haynes, and her sister, Jennifer Ebert. At first, McLean tried to act confused, as if he had no idea why Takoda was in such terrible condition. He insisted that his son had always been difficult, disobedient, and out of control. But the police weren't buying it. As they searched the house, they uncovered the horrifying truth about how Takoda had been living. There was no bedroom for him, no clean clothes, no school books, no toys. Instead, what they found was a dark, filthy attic, locked from the outside, filled with human waste, dirt, and a single broken chair. The only signs that a child had lived there were the bloodstains and discarded security camera wiring, which McLean had attempted to hide. As detectives pushed for answers, McLean began to change his story. At first, he denied harming Takoda. Then, when confronted with evidence, he shifted the blame first to his son, then to Hines and Ebert. Meanwhile, Amanda Hines started talking. She admitted that McLean had been abusing Takoda for years, and that she had witnessed and participated in his torture. She described how McLean forced Takoda to stand for hours, beat him with objects, poured hot sauce on his wounds, and made him eat his own waste. Her sister, Jennifer Ebert, confirmed everything. With overwhelming evidence and confessions from the household, officers arrested all three adults on December 13, 2019, the same night of Takoda's death. McLean was charged with murder, child abuse, child endangerment, and other felonies. Hines and Ebert were charged with involuntary manslaughter, child endangerment, and failing to report abuse. During his initial interrogation, McLean showed no remorse. When asked if he understood the charges against him, he only seemed concerned about how much prison time he might face. At one point, he even asked, "You can get the death penalty for this, right?" The detective responded, "That's not up to us. That's up to the prosecutors." But McLean wasn't worried about Takoda. He wasn't thinking about the pain and suffering his son had endured. He was only thinking about himself. As McLean sat in a holding cell, the public was about to learn the horrifying details of Takoda's death. And soon, people across Dayton, Ohio, and the entire country would be demanding justice. As news of Takoda Collins' tragic death spread, the Dayton community and the entire nation was in shock. People couldn't believe the horrific details that emerged about how Takoda had been tortured, neglected, and abused in his own home. The fact that teachers, neighbors, and even Child Protective Services, the Crown Prosecution Service, had received reports but failed to save Takoda fueled the public's outrage. Local news stations covered the case nonstop, detailing how McLean had locked his son in a filthy attic, starved him, and forced him to endure unthinkable suffering. People were asking the same question: how could this have happened? Parents, teachers, and child advocates demanded answers. How had the Crown Prosecution Service failed him? Why hadn't the school's reports been enough to remove Takoda from that home? In response to the growing outrage, Dayton's police department and social services were forced to answer tough questions. The Crown Prosecution Service confirmed that they had received multiple reports about Takoda's well-being, but somehow, McLean had always found a way to avoid serious investigation. Some former caseworkers admitted that the system was broken. They didn't have enough resources, too many children needed help, and some cases fell through the cracks. But no one wanted to hear excuses. A child had died, despite clear warning signs. A candlelight vigil was held in Dayton in honor of Takoda. People gathered, holding photos of him as a smiling, innocent little boy. They cried, they prayed, and they called for justice. Among the crowd was one of Takoda's former teachers who had reported abuse several times but felt unheard. With tears in her eyes, she said, "We did everything we could, we tried. But no one listened. And now, he's gone." On social media, justice for Takoda began trending. People from all over the country shared his story, demanding changes in the way child abuse cases were handled. Some activists pushed for stricter laws that would allow schools to intervene more aggressively when a child is at risk. Others called for harsher punishments for child abusers. Meanwhile, as the public mourned Takoda's death, the prosecutors were preparing to make sure his killers would never walk free again. As the case moved toward trial, McLean, Hines, and Ebert sat behind bars, knowing they would soon face the consequences of their horrific crimes. The world was watching. Would the justice system finally deliver the punishment they deserved? One thing was certain: Takoda Collins would never be forgotten. As the case moved toward trial, Al-Mutan McLean, Amanda Hines, and Jennifer Ebert sat in jail, awaiting their fate. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence against them: medical reports, crime scene photos, witness statements, and even their own admissions. McLean was the primary abuser, responsible for the years of torture and suffering Takoda endured. Hines and Ebert, though not the ones who inflicted most of the physical abuse, were willing accomplices. They lived in the same house, witnessed everything, and did nothing to stop it. The case didn't go to trial right away. There were months of legal proceedings, plea negotiations, and discussions between prosecutors and the defense attorneys. The public wanted the death penalty for McLean, but prosecutors decided not to seek it. Instead, they pursued the maximum life sentence possible. On February 23, 2021, McLean pleaded guilty to charges of murder, rape, and child endangerment. By avoiding trial, he likely hoped to secure a lesser sentence. Hines and Ebert also pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment. While they didn't physically beat Takoda the way McLean did, they stood by and let it happen day after day, year after year. Finally, on March 11, 2021, the sentencing hearing took place. The courtroom was packed with people, family members, community members, reporters, and child advocates, all waiting to hear what would happen. Before sentencing, Takoda's former teachers and social workers spoke about how they had tried to save him, but the system had failed. Some of them cried as they described his suffering, and the many times they had reported concerns to Child Protective Services. McLean sat stone-faced and silent, showing no emotion as the judge read his fate. For the murder, rape, and torture of his own son, McLean was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. This meant he would be in his 70s before he could even request parole. Hines was sentenced to 22 to 28 years in prison for her role in Takoda's suffering. Ebert, who had less direct involvement, received 8 years in prison. Some people in the courtroom felt McLean deserved the death penalty. Others were angry that Hines and Ebert didn't get life sentences too. But for many, the fact that all three were going to prison for decades was at least some form of justice. When the sentencing was over, McLean was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. As he walked past reporters, he said nothing. No apology. No last words about Takoda. For the first time in years, he had no control over anyone. He was no longer the one in power. Takoda never got justice while he was alive, but now, at least, his abusers would never be able to hurt another child again. As the trial ended and Takoda's killers were sentenced, the bigger question remained, how did this happen? How did a 10-year-old child suffer years of extreme abuse without anyone stopping it? The answer was devastating. The system failed him, over and over again. Takoda's school, Horseman Elementary, had been deeply concerned about him for years. Teachers noticed he came to school dirty, smelled of human waste, and had bruises. His haircuts were uneven and humiliating, making him an easy target for bullies. He looked like a child who was being neglected and mistreated. The school reported their concerns multiple times to Child Protective Services, the Crown Prosecution Service. At least 17 reports were made, but nothing changed. Each time the Crown Prosecution Service came to investigate, McLean knew how to manipulate the system. When caseworkers arrived, McLean coached Takoda on what to say. He threatened him to stay quiet and forced him to pretend everything was fine. If the Crown Prosecution Service scheduled a follow-up visit, McLean cleaned the house just enough to make it look like things were under control. The Crown Prosecution Service caseworkers also struggled with high caseloads and limited resources. Some cases slipped through the cracks. In some instances, children were removed from homes too quickly, and in others they were left behind when they needed to be saved. When Takoda was 7 years old, the Crown Prosecution Service should have intervened. Instead, the reports were not taken seriously enough. He was allowed to stay with McLean, the man who would ultimately kill him. The failures didn't stop there. In 2018, McLean pulled Takoda out of school under the pretense of homeschooling him. In reality, this was done to isolate him completely. Without school, there were no teachers to see his bruises, no nurses to report his condition, and no classmates to witness his suffering. Ohio's homeschooling laws did not require strict monitoring. Parents who claimed they would educate their children at home were not required to submit proof that they were actually teaching. Because of this loophole, McLean was able to completely hide Takoda from the outside world. Takoda's mother, Robin Collins, also tried to find her son. After losing custody when Takoda was a baby, she had little control over his whereabouts. McLean moved from Wisconsin to Ohio without informing the courts, making it impossible for Robin to track them down. In the end, no one was able to help him in time. Every system that was supposed to protect children, the schools, the courts failed Takoda. After his death, lawmakers and child advocates pushed for changes. They wanted stronger laws to ensure that when multiple reports of abuse were made, investigations would go deeper. They also questioned homeschooling laws, arguing that children like Takoda should not be so easily hidden from society. The failures that led to Takoda's death were a painful lesson, but the hope was that his story would save other children from suffering the same fate. Even after the trial ended and his abusers were sent to prison, Takoda Collins' story remained in the hearts of many. His death was a reminder of how dangerous silence can be, how child abuse often hides in plain sight, and how a broken system can fail the most vulnerable. In Dayton, Ohio, where Takoda had spent his short and painful life, a memorial was set up in his honor. People brought candles, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes expressing their sorrow. Some people wrote messages apologizing to Takoda, saying they were sorry that no one had saved him in time. Others promised to be more aware and to speak up whenever they suspected a child was in danger. At his former school, Horrifying Elementary, teachers and staff gathered to honor his memory. They shared stories of the bright, kind boy they had once known, a boy who had loved to draw, who smiled despite everything he was going through, and who had so much life left to live. One of his teachers said, "He always seemed happy to be at school. It was the only place he felt safe. I wish we could have done more." The case led to serious discussions about reforming child protection laws in Ohio and across the country. Lawmakers and child advocates pushed for stronger intervention policies, especially in cases where a child was repeatedly reported to the Crown Prosecution Service. Some of the proposed changes included stronger oversight of homeschooling, so children could not be so easily isolated, better communication between schools and the Crown Prosecution Service, ensuring that when teachers report concerns, those concerns are followed up on, harsher punishments for child abuse, ensuring that people like McLean, Haynes, and Ebert never have a chance to harm another child again. Activists also called for more awareness. They encouraged neighbors, teachers, and family members to report signs of abuse and to keep reporting, even if nothing happens at first. Takoda's tragic death was a wake-up call, but it also became a symbol of change. People who had never spoken about child abuse before were now discussing it openly. Schools, churches, and communities began to train people on how to spot abuse and take action. Though Takoda never got the childhood he deserved, his story became one that changed lives. His name became a reminder that no child should ever be left to suffer in silence. Years from now, people will still remember Takoda Collins, not just as the boy who failed, but as the child whose story helped protect others. As the candles flickered at his memorial and people whispered their final goodbyes, one message remained clear: Takoda Collins' story is not just a tragedy, it's a warning. A warning about what happens when signs of abuse are ignored, when systems meant to protect children fail, and when silence allows cruelty to continue. This wasn't just one person's crime. This was a failure on every level. But now the question is, what can we do? How many other children are suffering right now, hidden behind closed doors, waiting for someone to save them? If you ever see something, hear something, feel that something isn't right, speak up. Keep speaking up. You might be the only chance a child has. Let Takoda's story be the reminder that no child should suffer in silence. Justice came too late for him, but it doesn't have to come too late for the next child. If this story moved you, share it. Keep his memory alive, and most importantly, be the voice for those who have none. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And remember, your voice could save a life.